Paul.
Thank you.
President Paul.
Thank you very much for that very nice welcome. And thank you, Paul, and thank you, Elizabeth, for those introductions. That's very nice. And I want to make two little introductions here, but very important introductions. My wife, Carol, and one granddaughter, Linda, are sitting down here. Well, it does look like a lot of people here. You know, sometimes we get thousands of people out. And then sometimes the next day they'll say in the paper, yes, there was a very nice rally on such and such campus. Hundreds of people turned out. So I can see hundreds of people turned out tonight. It is great. But our job is great too. It's a major task to change this country around because we have been drifting from the original intent of our Constitution for the last 100 years, long time before you were born, that the problem started. And tragically, you as a generation are inheriting it. The burden will fall on you to change things. But we have a great tradition. We have a great history. We know where we have come from. We know what we have to do. The blueprint has been laid out. So let's all of a sudden decide that we're not going to send anybody to Washington that doesn't believe and will follow the Constitution of the United States. You know, in the announcements that Paul gave, he indicated that the First Amendment is very, very important to your campus, and obviously that is the case. Without the First Amendment, it is very difficult for us to get our message out. But I want to make sure the First Amendment is protected on the internet as well. Every once in a while there'll be a court case and there will be some controversial language involved, and the courts are supposed to decide, is it constitutional to say these controversial things? Well, let me tell you, the First Amendment wasn't written so you can talk about the weather. It was written so we can talk about controversial things and even challenge our own government. And we live in an age where systematically our civil liberties have been under attack. And this is what we should be concerned about. The answer comes, for so many of our problems, by just understanding what liberty is all about. And liberty doesn't come because we belong to a group. You don't have liberty because you're a hyphenated American anyway. You have liberty because you have a right to your life, you have a right to your liberty, and you should have a right to keep all the fruits of your labor. But it's been going on for a good many years, but it's been especially bad in the last 10 years, the attack of civil liberties. During this administration, it hasn't been helpful, even though there were a few of us that had hoped that some of the protections of civil liberties and the avoidance of the federal government coming in and enforcing some drug laws and different things would be different. Unfortunately, it isn't. But if we need laws to restrain individuals in any way possible, they should be state laws, it shouldn't be the federal government, and it shouldn't be the DEA. We know about the case of Daniel, one of the students here, of being arrested and thrown into prison and forgotten for 5 days. Ending up in an intensive care unit. And then it's done in the name of being a compassionate conservative. That's not compassion at all. So we need to understand what the real protection of liberty is all about. Now it's indicated that there may be a lawsuit coming out of this, and rightfully so. But it's always difficult when you're abused by a government to sue the government. Sometimes the government protects itself from lawsuits, especially the federal government. So we don't know exactly what will come from that. But I have a suggestion. You know, in a way, there should be justice for an abuse of liberty like this. But in some way, should the penalty be placed on the taxpayer? I mean, you question that. Well, not exactly, but who else is going to pay because they were working for the taxpayer? And there's some truth to that. But What I would like to do is make sure that any agent of government that abuses the rights of an individual, they personally are liable and should be sued. This, of course, is my suggestion. I introduced legislation dealing with the TSA, and it says this. It says that a TSA agent can't do anything to a stranger that you or I can't do, and if they do, they go to prison. Our government is actually out of control. It's moving in the wrong direction. It believes it has the authority and the moral responsibility to make individuals better people and that they can protect you against yourself. Governments are incapable of doing that, and if they assume that that is their right and a role, they cannot do it without the destruction of liberty. So first we have to cancel this notion out that the federal government, any government, can protect us against ourselves. In a free society, you should be allowed to lead your life as you choose, but suffer the consequences if you make a mistake, but also that the government can't come in and tell us what we do with our personal lifestyles. In the same sense, the government should be coming in and trying to not only improve individuals in their lifestyle, but trying to improve the economy by forcibly redistributing wealth and passing it on to the special interest groups. That's just as bad. What we should have, of course, is a government that's limited. We should ask the question, what should the role of government be? The founders of this country asked that, and they came down with a pretty precise conclusion. The purpose of a limited government should be for the protection of liberty, and no more complicated than that. Which means, of course, that we should have a strong national defense, we should have a judicial system, but it shouldn't be involved in the entitlement system, and it shouldn't be involved in believing that not only that we have a responsibility as a government to tell people how to run, but we certainly shouldn't be in the business of pretending that we can tell other countries what to do in their own country. There's a recent case in the news today. The young man, Qian, the blind Chinese individual that was being harassed by his own government. His civil liberties obviously sounds like they were abused, and he goes into the American embassy, and now he was released, and it's a diplomatic controversy that is going on. And you will hear and see a lot of our politicians grabbing hold and grabbing the spotlight by saying, you know what we need to do? We need to crack down on those Chinese, and this is what they're doing. They're abusing their citizens, which may well be true. But how much authority do we have, and how much benefit do you think we have in lecturing and changing China? At the same time, what's happening to the civil liberties of individuals here in this country? That's where we have responsibility. Now we are a country that is known throughout the Arab world that we are a country that uses torture. Torture is not part of a free society. We also have endorsed now for nearly 10 years the concept of preemptive war. That is that we start the wars. That's wrong. The wars in this country are supposed to only be fought with a declaration of war and not preemptively. And also, we had something that was recently passed this year that I believe that most of us should agree that we should repeal it, and that is that provision in the Defense Appropriation Act. That idea that the federal government can use the Army to arrest American citizens. That's a violation of our civil liberties too. So I believe our responsibility as individuals in this country, as people in the government, and as a president, that we should try to set a standard of protection of all liberties, economic and political liberties. And if we do a good job, maybe other countries would do much better themselves, but we can't force it upon them. We cannot invade other countries and tell them, we are going to tell you how you live. We should set a standard, and hopefully they will want to emulate it. Our job here is at home. But we have a lot of things that we have to change, but the guideline, of course, is our Constitution. And Article 1, Section 8 outlines it pretty definitely on what those authorities are, explicitly approximately 20 items, depends on how you count, of ideas and principles that we're allowed to do and have the authority to do. And, of course, one is the declaration of war. And if that is the case, just think how many wars would have been fought since World War II? None. Just think of how much money we'd have saved. Think of how much richer we would be. Think about how much less debt we would have. Think how much less pervasive this whole notion of deficit spending would be. This country would be so much wealthier. In the very last 10 years, we added $4 trillion of debt for these wars that are going on, and we don't even know why we're there. We don't know when they're going to end, and we have no purpose there, and they cause more harm than good. So obey the Constitution, and we would have a lot less wars. Of course, the Constitution is very clear about the monetary issue. The monetary issue is very clearly stated that the Congress has the responsibility of providing a legal tender only silver and gold. No paper money, no central bank, no Federal Reserve System at all. Started immediately after the Constitution was written. Jefferson and Hamilton argued about it. We had a first national bank, and Jefferson got rid of it. And then there was a second national bank, this attempt to have national banking and central banking. And then Andrew Jackson, another gold standard person, got rid of that bank. So let's look forward to the day, hopefully in the near future, we have a president that will get rid of this third national bank. I think we should, next year, 100 years, Federal Reserve will be 100 years old in 2013. So I would say the appropriate celebration will be the repeal of the Federal Reserve Act next year. A lot of people ask me, well, who's going to do all those good things that the Federal Reserve does if you don't have a Federal Reserve? I said, yeah, like not bailing out the rich bankers and bailing out Wall Street and bailing out everybody. So, no, the central bank does not help the average person. But they claim they do. They claim they're protecting everybody. But, yeah, they bail out the banks, they give free money to the banks, and they send down it back to the government, and they make 2 or 3 points on this. At the same time, the people who save and want to take care of themselves and act responsibly, and they put their money in their bank and they have a CD, what do they get? 1%? And then the inflation rate might be 6%, and then they wonder why they're getting behind. The American people are getting behind. The standard of living has dropped for most people in middle class, especially those on fixed incomes, in the last 10 years. And this is why people feel unhappy about the way things are going. And this is the reason I'm sure young people graduating from college, you come out with debt, you have trouble finding jobs, and the country is indebted, and the wars are endless, and an entitlement system that entitles the well-connected to the benefits, and then the people who were supposed to be helped, like the people who were going to get these free houses and easy credit, they ended up losing their jobs and losing their houses. It's a system that doesn't work, and this is what has been confirmed in these last 5 years. And the reason why there's so much attention given to the freedom movement is the evidence is out on the table that welfareism, inflationism, and socialism does not work. What we need is freedom in this country and a lot less government. Of course, the consequence of the foreign policy has been great. It has not been great because of all the cost, but all the enemies that are made. They talk about, well, is the Al-Qaeda gone? Will there be any more Al-Qaeda? And the real story is that there's a lot of people out there that still dislike us, and they're going to dislike all of us, because now we've taken it upon ourselves to say the global war on terrorism is global, and we have the authority and the responsibility to look at every square inch of this country, in the world, and that we have the capability to hitting any postage stamp spot to kill those bad people. And guess what? We're doing it, and guess what? Sometimes we miss, sometimes the kids get killed, and sometimes innocent bystanders get killed. You don't build friendships that way, and believe me, we are more vulnerable, we are less secure because of that type of foreign policy than if we followed one of friendship and trade with countries. The student in China that I believe that diplomatic thing will pass, and there will be not a major problem. I think it will not be a significant event, because there's a reason for that. Because we do, at least in spite of our shortcomings and China's shortcomings, there is a benefit to talking to China and trading with China. We get goods that are cheaper, and of course China likes to sell us goods, and even with all the shortcoming, this is the reason that we're not likely to have a war incident over this. 30, 40, 50 years ago, we'd have been probably on the verge of shooting and killing each other like we did when I was in high school during the Korean fiasco. But now, because we trade with people, they have second thoughts. This is why trading and friendship is so important. The founders talked about that and said that we should do that. But what do the enemies of our movement say? Oh, you're a bunch of isolationists and you don't want to deal with the world. Tell you, I think it's a lot better to deal with the world with friendship and trade than it is with bombs and intimidation. Unfortunately, we've only had two options on foreign policy. One option would be to go to a potential dictator and talk him into being our friendly dictator, and then we give him a lot of money. And then if we finally dislike that friendly dictator, or he turns on us, then we start bombing them. So I would say there should be a third option, that option, at least talking to people. The 60,000 diplomats that we have in the State Department, I think we ought to put them to work. Let them practice a little diplomacy once in a while. But unfortunately, those in charge right now are much more enthusiastic about the intimidation. But the other side that accuses us of isolationism are the very first ones to want to put on sanctions on country, to say that we're going to put sanctions on and punish the leaders like we have been doing for 50 years with Castro. But guess what? The people suffer. It never punishes the leaders. The leaders use us as a scapegoat and say they suffer not because of communism or their system, but because of Americans being involved. So it doesn't work. Matter of fact, the sanctions on Iran actually backfire on us, because the dissidents that would like to change our government then all have to get together for nationalistic reasons and come together and stand behind their government. So I think sanctions are wrong, and sanctions are just an act of war. And it's time to get rid of all the sanctions on Cuba. Let's get the Cold War over with for good. The Soviet system, when I was in the Air Force in the 60s, there was a pretty serious Cold War going on. There were missiles in Cuba, and we had to be alert. The world is quite different now. But the whole effort that is being made to us, I think, is overdone. I think we just do way too much at the wrong time and spend too much money, and we make too many enemies. So what we need to do, obviously, is change this foreign policy. And the foreign policy is one that's been around a long time, and it was actually started by Woodrow Wilson and at the turn of the last century. And this whole notion that we can make the world safe for democracy, and now it's been translated into this neoconservatism where they feel morally obligated that we must use force to spread our goodness because we are an exceptional nation. If we are an exceptional nation and set a good standard, yes, then maybe they'll emulate us, but we're not very exceptional if we think that we can intimidate people and believe in preemptive war and starting wars that we can't even finish. But we have a long way to go because, unfortunately, the leadership in both parties are very much in agreement with much of the problems that we have today. If you look at the foreign policy, does it ever change? I mean, we elect a Democrat. We hope the Democrat will be less warmongering. And, of course, there was some encouragement. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for peace, so what the heck? Well, we're on our way. So then the next day he expands the war and invades another country. So it doesn't work. And, of course, when we get the Republicans in charge, the Republicans are the fiscal conservatives. And just look at what's happened when we had the House and the Senate and the presidency. The Department of Education doubled in size. The prescription drug program started satisfying the drug companies and the big businesses. That gets passed and added on. So, and the deficits explode. So what we need is a constitutional president that will not yield to those temptations. So we have, we know what the problems are, we know what the solutions are, but the political drama is still there. We have an election coming up, we know what has to be done. We don't know what the results will be in California. I do want to report to you, though, that we have spent a fair amount of time in California. We've spent 2 weeks here, and the campuses have been very welcome and open to our ideas. We're hoping for a surprise on election day to the point where maybe the mainstream media will have to cover what we're doing. But we don't know exactly what will happen on that election, or what will happen in August in Tampa, or what will happen in November. But I can tell you that we are winning a tremendous battle. And that is that we are winning the battle for the hearts and minds of the American people who are sick and tired of what they're getting out of Washington, D.C. You know, I think about winning or losing the individual battles and what we strive for to win the ultimate battle. I think of a conversation between two colonels after the Vietnam War. Colonel 2 from Vietnam was talking to Colonel Harry Summers. It was shortly after the fighting stopped, and they were going back and forth on the details of ending the war. And Summers wanted to get the last word in, and he looked at Colonel 2 and said, "You do know that you never defeated us once on the battlefield." And 2 said, "Colonel, you're exactly right, but it's irrelevant." It's irrelevant because they won the war. Because they were representing the hearts and minds of people who thought the French and the Americans didn't have a right to be in their country, trying to settle a civil war. So when you're fighting for your country, it's a lot different, and you do end up ultimately very often winning. And just think of how many years, decades, hundreds of years, or centuries that the people of Afghanistan said, "We want to run our own life. We have enough problems. We'll take care of them, but we don't want the Soviets in here, and we don't want the Americans in this country. We want you out of here now." It's always much easier if you're defending a homeland to ultimately win the battle, but when the military has tremendous force, you can lose a lot of battles, but you eventually will lose the war. But the Soviet system was doomed to fail, and it was predicted by Austrian economists as far back as 1912 by Mises, that socialism can't work, because you lose your pricing structure. Without the pricing structure, you don't know what supply and demands are. You get malinvestment, you get too much debt, and all these problems of inflation. So, but he said that it would fail, and it did. So as terrible as the Cold was, with the confrontation of thousands of missiles, the Soviets had 30,000 and we had nearly as many as well, and it was very, very dangerous. But we didn't have to fight it with a nuclear exchange. Here today we are intimidated by a third world country that has no army of sorts and no navy, no air force, no intercontinental ballistic missiles, no nuclear weapons, and we were ready to go to war because someday, someplace, they might get a nuclear weapon, and yet we stood the Soviets down. I would say that we shouldn't be so easily intimidated. Now the Soviets were defeated for a very precise reason. For economic reasons. They overextended themselves, which empires almost inevitably do. They overextend themselves, they spend themselves into bankruptcy, and their economic system collapses. Now, bin Laden had a precise plan to get us more involved in the Middle East by sending individuals over here to cause harm, because he thought that we might then take the bait and go over there and occupy at least one Muslim country. Of course, how many countries are we in now? We can't even count them. There's so many. His plan was to get us involved in one country and get us bogged down into war over there. His other plan was to cause dissent in this country. He was, I'm sure, thinking about the dissent of the 1960s of the Vietnam War. But the other plan that he had was to bankrupt our country by overextending ourselves overseas. And here we have done exactly what he was looking for us to do, and we have sacrificed another 8,500 Americans, 40,000 Americans severely wounded, hundreds of thousands begging and pleading for help at the Veterans Administration. We have an epidemic of suicides with our military, more people dying from suicide than we do from combat. So we're not winning this war because we're not willing to take and look at what the CIA has told us and taught us. They said, be careful what we do. Not only are there unintended consequences with our foreign policy, but watch out, there will be blowback and we will suffer the consequences. This is the reason why we have to come to our senses and change our foreign policy to national defense and not world domination. Intellectual revolution is well in place. There was an intellectual revolution prior to our first revolution that lasted probably 100 years. And the founders were well versed in history. They knew about the Magna Carta. They knew about Old Testament history. They knew the dangers of kings. So they were well versed about property rights. And finally there was a political action, which was the revolution and the writing of the Constitution. Well, today the intellectual revolution is much more successful than what we see in Washington. This has been going on for 30 or 40 years. It's been quiescent, but it has been now bearing fruit today with this generation, because it is this generation that has required that we bring forth in a presidential election for the first time since the Fed was started, that the Federal Reserve is an issue in this presidential election. But the intellectual revolution now is in place, and we're reacting to that, and I think that's the hard work. But we are further along than I ever dreamed. Let me tell you, I always worked on the assumption that maybe I could vote and try to set a standard the best I can, and maybe somebody in later years would look and say, yeah, I think he understood what was going on. But believe me, the revolution is alive and well and growing by leaps and bounds. Looks like truly it is an idea whose time has come, and armies will not stop us, nor will the government stop us. You know, in the 1960s, they had a saying that if you weren't a bleeding heart liberal when you were 20, you didn't have a heart. And then they also said that if you weren't a good conservative by the time you were 40, you didn't have a brain. And I'm suggesting that the freedom movement has both a heart and a brain at the same time. But a true true revolution should have high standards and high ideals and high goals, and we have to strive for something that seems almost impossible. And it seemed to me that it was impossible. I think it's possible now. I really believe it is possible for you as a generation to bring about the changes in a very positive way. But the striving for what seems to be impossible is key. But it does require passion. It does require the emotions and people to get charged up and involved and taken upon themselves. This is what's happening around the country. Individuals throughout the country aren't getting directions from me or our campaign, but they're spontaneously getting involved and they're doing the thing that they want to do, and they're getting very much involved. But this revolution is involved with not only passion but reason. And this is important. It isn't the fact that just we have the energy, but we have to answer the questions. We have to answer the questions why the foreign policy is wrong. Answer the question why central banking is wrong. Why it's silly to have paper money and not sound money. And why the entitlement system helps the wealthy, not the poor. You have to have those answers, and we can win if we get that information out. And it is true that the harder and the more difficult the conflict seems, the greater the sense of satisfaction is when we win. And this will be tedious. It will not be easy. If you could just wave a wand and it would be over, and you can elect a person a week later have all these changes made, it's not going to happen that way. But the seeds have been planted. There is no way that they can silence the freedom movement today. It is going to be heard from. One thing about freedom that I think is so important, I have many times said that freedom is popular. And there's a very good reason why it's popular, because when it is popular, it means it should be popular with everybody. Freedom shouldn't benefit one class of people or one group of people. It should benefit all of us, and it should bring people together. Not because we know what people should do with their lives or how to spend their money, but precisely the opposite. But we should be able to come together because of the diversity. Because we want to protect diversity. We want people to have their own lifestyles and not be told how to run their own lives. And of course, in the economic sphere, we want people to have the incentive to work hard and save and spend the money they want. But the big problem is some people might not do a very good job, and that's what invites the do-gooder, the nanny state mentality to come in and say, well, he won't take care of himself, we have to do it, and he might use his freedom in a certain way, and we have to make sure that we look after him. Yes, in a free society there will be some of that, but think about it when the politician and the bureaucrat makes a decision and they make a wrong decision because they can't possibly know what is best for you or how to spend your money. So when they can make the decision, it does harm for all of us. So that is why you want the individuals to make their own decision about their own lives and their own money. One other problem with freedom, because people will misuse it, the one rule is you can't ever use it to hurt anybody else. But the other thing is that people are conditioned to believe that if you legalize freedom of choice, or what you put in your mouth, or what you put in your lungs, and what you eat, and all these things, that means you endorse what they do. But that's not true. You don't endorse what people do with their freedoms. We don't endorse religious freedom. Some people have various religions. Some people have no religion. But we don't, because we have freedom of religion, we don't endorse it. Intellectually, we don't say, well, we have freedom to study whatever we want. But that doesn't mean we endorse what people read or what they do. But unfortunately, for now, quite a few years, 100 years maybe, we have gotten this notion that if we allow people to make up their own minds about what they put in their bodies, it could be wrong, and therefore we have to regulate. It's gotten to such a point now where you are losing your right to decide whether or not you can drink raw milk. I think in a free society, you ought to be able to smoke what you want, drink what you want. And if you do any harm to anybody else, you're in big trouble. If you do harm to yourself, you have to suffer the consequences, and you can't go begging for help from your neighbor. Drugs are very dangerous, and I admonish my children and my grandchildren to be very, very cautious because they are very dangerous, and people can get addicted. But I also know that the war on drugs has been much more damaging to our liberties, and it hurts everybody, than the drugs themselves. And also, if you're worried about addiction, what are you going to do about the addiction of prescription drugs? That's where the real problems are. So we have to have more confidence in ourselves. We have lost confidence in believing that freedom works and that freedom is a solution, that people might misuse their freedoms. So we need more confidence, but we need a better understanding, because when they tell you, well, this freedom is a good thing, but it's only going to help the rich, which is wrong. It's the system we have today that helps the rich at the punishment of the poor. The entitlement system doesn't work. So what we want is a fairer system, which means that the incentive system works and allows people to work hard and take care of themselves and get the benefit and the satisfaction of taking care of oneself. That's what we need again. The ultimate goals in life are something very personal. Some people might not have much goals at all. Some people not want to be educated, and they might not want to work. But ultimately, I think most people who care about society and care about their fellow man, people want to strive, in my estimation, at least that's what I want, strive for excellence and virtue. If that is the goal in a free society, then you want the government out of the way. Because when government gets in the way, they ruin the whole thing. They just mess things up. Too often, we make this assumption that government will be there, will take care of us, and everything is going to be all right. Our experiment with liberty has been the greatest experiment in the history of the world. We became the most prosperous. We had the largest middle class, and we were a creditor nation. Today, we owe $5 trillion. We have a middle class that's shrinking and getting poorer. We have now the standard of living for the average American has been going down for 12 years. That's why people feel badly about the way it is today. The unemployment rate for certain categories, the young teenagers, college graduates, it's very, very tough. And so when the government comes along, and today they made the announcement, the unemployment rate just went down. But what the problem is they don't count everybody. People who drop out, they don't count. And the people who stop looking for work, and there were 34 million new people in the last 10 years. Essentially, no new jobs have been created. So there's really a serious problem with the unemployment. And it's because we've had a managed economy for a long time. We have been taught by the liberal professors that the reason we get into recession, the people won't spend the money. Of course, how do you spend the money if you don't have a job and you're all maxed out on credit cards? You can't spend money. So they recognize that possibility, and the Bernankes of the world say, you know what we need to do is the government then needs to spend the money. And deficits don't matter. And the truth is, deficits do matter. And we've lived too long on the assumptions that governments are different than individuals. But individuals who live beyond their means eventually live beneath their means. And countries that do the same thing will live beneath their means. And that is what we're ushering in, an age right now of living beneath our means. And that is the reason we have to have significant changes. And it's not going back to the old days, and the old age, and the old standard, the gold standard. I mean, what is old is tyranny. And the other side wants to go back and have more tyranny and more authoritarianism. So what we want to do is go back and pick up the pieces of what a free society was all about and build on it, have a better gold standard, and a better understanding of foreign policy and economic policy. Now, if we fail to do this, I can tell you, if only 10 people showed up tonight, I would have been a little bit discouraged. But now I continue to be encouraged because I think the changes will come, and they are going to come. And which means if we lose a battle here and there, don't get discouraged. courage because we're going to win the war. And we have a better advantage than any other country because we have great traditions. We did have the freest society. We have a good document if we don't follow it. We knew once what sound money was all about. We had a good concept of private property and contract rights. Today, of course, the government cancels contracts more than they enforce contracts. We used to have a good, sound understanding about private property rights. That's been under systematic attack. So when we get to this point of returning and picking up those pieces, we can restate those principles of sound money and property rights and contract rights, a sensible foreign policy and balanced budgets. And the emphasis on, the most important issue, is the emphasis on the individual. The individuals who we all have this natural right, not because we belong to a group. We should never get benefits because we belong to a group, and we should never get any disadvantages because we belong to a group. And if that is the case, I believe we will all come together, and the groups will be diverse. And I think our campaign has demonstrated this, because one of the real challenges is going to some of the Republican primary debates. And because the message is a message for more people than just in a narrow group. Because it is a message for fiscal conservatives, it's a message for those who believe in civil liberties, it's a message who wants a different foreign policy. And instead of compromising our principles and saying, well, I'll give this and maybe try to bring people together, that's what they did for decades. The liberals and conservatives got together in spending. And of course they exhausted all the wealth, but now we can't have that type of compromise. We have to stand on principles that will appeal to different groups and bring people together for different reasons. And that issue is individualism and freedom for that individual. Because there's so much positive activity going on in the country today, I am optimistic that by doing this, that we will have the best chance of not only restoring peace to this country, that we will restore prosperity to this country, and once again restore the greatness of America, which we all should strive for. Thank you very much for coming today.
Sexy Phil, this is for your PDS and for SourceFed.